Well, many Western analysts believe Iran is quickly running out of foreign reserves, meaning it will no longer be able to buy necessary imports. Some diplomats anticipate the economy will implode by spring. The sanctions no doubt cause a lot of suffering, but many believe these measures are necessary and will affect change. Mark Dubowitz is the executive director of the Washington, D.C. Policy Institute, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, and he's in our Washington studio this morning. Hello, Mark.
Hi, Pia. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. Well, we've been hearing accounts of how the sanctions are affecting ordinary people, but do you think that they're actually going far enough?
Well, Pia, I don't think so. I mean, I think the reality is we've done extensive economic modeling on the Iranian economy, and it suggests that Iran actually has probably sufficient foreign exchange reserves to forestall economic collapse for at least another 2 years. So if you really put the economic cripple date when the Iranian regime will run out of foreign exchange reserves against the nuclear threshold date, it's clear that Iranian nuclear physics is beating Western economic pressure.
You know, it sounds, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but a little bit crass when we've just heard that ordinary Iranians saying themselves that they're really suffering under these sanctions and arguing that this is really having no effect on the government. So where would you like to see further sanctions applied so it affects the government and no further regular Iranians?
Well, first, Pia, we don't have a choice between good and bad options here. We have a choice between bad and worse options. And the worst option of all is a nuclear-armed Iran, a terror-sponsoring, human rights-abusing, genocide-threatening regime that would have its finger on a nuclear trigger. So I think that when we assess the situation in Iran, it's a lot of bad options. I think the worst option would be a nuclear-armed Iran. I think if you really wanted to hit the regime hard, there are other things you could do. You could designate the central bank of Iran. You could cut off the foreign exchange reserves that are being held in foreign financial institutions by the regime and regime elements. You could put a significant ban or blacklisting on Iran's energy sector. All of this is going to affect the Iranian people. There have been no sanctions in history that don't affect the average person. In South Africa, sanctions disproportionately affected black South Africans. In Iraq, clearly, sanctions had a devastating impact on the Iraqi people. But in both cases, sanctions actually achieved their policy objectives. So the worst option is a nuclear-armed Iran. I think everybody wants to also forestall the possibility of military strikes against Iran because the Iranian people would obviously suffer from military action. I think sanctions are the least bad alternative we have in our foreign policy arsenal.
A lot was made about the recent EU embargo on Iranian oil. It was really supposed to, put the noose tighter around the Iranian regime. Has it affected the country?
Well, it has. The oil embargo has had a significant impact. I mean, again, Iran's oil earnings are its principal form of foreign currency earnings. They represent about 80% of hard currency earnings and about 70% of the Iranian government budget. So you've seen a significant drop from about 2.5 million barrels a day to about 1 million barrels a day. But still, the Iranian regime will earn about $50 billion in oil earnings this year. It's definitely on the decline, and the sanctions are having an impact. But $50 billion is only 17% less than they earned in 2010. This is still a regime with a lot of money and with a lot of ability to withstand the current sanctions. Okay,
you've made the case that the economy needs to implode sooner rather than later to stop what you say is the worst case scenario, which is Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. How close do you believe that Iran is getting to nuclear weapon capability?
Well, actually, it's not important what I believe. It's important what the International Atomic Energy Agency
believes. There is a lot of debate.
There's not actually that much debate. In fact, the IAEA has been very clear about how much uranium Iran has. A number of leading experts in Washington believe that the Iranians could be anywhere between 4 to 6 months away from having the medium-grade uranium they need to then very quickly turn that into military-grade uranium and weaponize. So the IAEA, the Israelis, the French, the United States are all pretty clearly on side with respect to nuclear weapons capacity. The real debate really is between when the Iranians reach capacity and when the supreme leader makes the political decision to actually sneak out or break out for a nuclear bomb.
Over the weekend, there have been reports that both the U.S. and Iran has agreed to direct one-on-one bilateral talks. Neither the government has confirmed that, but that's what's being said out there. Do you take away from that these sanctions then are having an effect on the Iranian regime if it is perhaps willing to sit down face-to-face with the U.S.?
Well, if that's the case, this will be the fourth round of negotiations, and I think it's clear that there's no way the Iranian regime would have showed up for negotiations in the past if not for these sanctions. And clearly these sanctions are really biting, which is why they've reportedly reached out to the United States for bilateral negotiations. So clearly they're there at the table or are willing to go to the table because of sanctions, but we've got no evidence to date that it's changed the risk-reward calculus of the regime and changed the supreme leader's nuclear policy.
It's a bit hard to get a true sense of how unpopular the president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, may really be with his citizens. But how unpopular do you believe he's becoming?
I don't think it really matters. I mean, he really is a lame duck in the truest sense of the word. The president of Iran has very little political power as it is. The power is vested with the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. And this president, Ahmadinejad, has less power because he's directly assaulted the supreme leader and their Iranian Revolutionary Guards. So I think there's always been a lot of focus on him because of his Holocaust denial, because his denial that there are homosexuals in Iran, because of his outrageous remarks. But Ahmadinejad really is a lame duck, and it's the supreme leader that really matters on the key strategic questions for the Iranian regime.
And how much pressure do you think they're facing from their regular citizens? We did see small protests in Tehran over the deflating rial. Is that level of government coming under any pressure from regular, everyday Iranians?
Well, I think they are. I mean, I think the protests were quite small and they were repressed very quickly. I mean, you saw in 2009 millions of Iranians on the street yelling, "Death to the dictator, President Obama, are you with us or are you with the dictator?" Unfortunately, the U.S. administration decided that they could cut a deal with Khamenei and they remained silent. But I think this regime fundamentally understands that there is the risk of real social protest. They remember that what brought down the Shah in 1979 were actually massive strikes through the economy, including the oil sector. And I think they live in fear of their people. If they didn't, they'd be bringing millions of Iranians to the street, putting them in central Tehran, and giving them money to burn Obama in effigy. The reason Khamenei doesn't do that is because he lives in fear that those protests would turn against him.
There is the risk, though, that they could, turn their people at some level against the West, blame this all on the West, saying the sanctions are the reason that, your food prices have gone up, that you can't buy whatever you used to be able to buy so easily. In that sense, could the sanctions backfire and make Iranians, quote unquote, hate the West and embolden the government of Iran?
I think there's always a risk of that. I think we've seen no evidence of that. And I think the best evidence of that is what I suggested. If the regime believed that they could do that, they would bring millions of Iranians to Tehran, put them in the central square, and as I said, burn Obama in effigy. I think Khamenei understands his people, and he understands the level of hatred that most Iranians have for this regime. They've lived under 30 years of brutal repression, of human rights abuses, of massive corruption. They know the regime has stolen their oil wealth and stolen their livelihood. And I think that the evidence today suggests that they are blaming the regime. It could change, but for now, I think the Iranian people know who the real culprits are.
How do you see the situation in Iran playing out over the next few weeks and few months?
Well, I think there's very little time for diplomacy. There's very little time for sanctions to work. I think that next year we may be facing an awful decision between a nuclear-armed Iran and military strikes to forestall that possibility, which is all the more reason why, as hard as it is to stomach these sanctions, to contemplate more sanctions, sanctions are really the best peaceful alternative to trying to change the decision-making calculus of this regime. We have very little time, and if we don't resolve this diplomatically, I think 2013, 2014 could be some dire times.
Mark Dubowitz, thanks for talking with us this morning.
Thanks, Pia.
Mark Dubowitz is the executive director of the Washington, D.C. Policy Institute, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Well, send us